Hello, my name is Matthew Reynolds, and this is my presentation on Chennault and the Flying Tigers. I picked this topic because before I researched them, I did not know that they existed, and it sounded pretty interesting. Quick introduction and some questions I hope to answer with this presentation are: who was General Claire Lee Chennault? Who are the Flying Tigers? What kind of aircraft did the Flying Tigers fly? And how did the Flying Tigers impact World War II? Here I have a short 4-minute video that I'd like everybody to watch. It gives a brief overview of the things that I'm going to cover in this presentation.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor has the emotions of the American public running the gamut. Anger, fear, disgust, grief, and disbelief have the American psyche in turmoil. But as the reality of the attack has had time to settle in, there is an ever-growing sense of frustration at America's inability to strike back at the Japanese. The Navy is still staggering from the blow at Pearl. The Army and Marines are busy training their new recruits, building the forces that will be necessary before any offensive action by the United States will be possible. In Asia, however, a group of Americans known as the Flying Tigers is making the Japanese pay dearly for their bombing excursions over China and Burma. Flying old P-40s with their noses painted to resemble a shark bearing its teeth, the Americans are giving the Japanese Air Force all it can handle. This group of volunteers is led by a flamboyant colonel named Claire Chennault. In the years between the wars, when most of the officers in the Army Air Corps were unabashed proponents of the heavy bomber, claiming it was an invincible weapon, Chennault remained a vocal advocate of the fighter plane. He argued that the pursuit plane's ineffectiveness was not due to design limitations of the plane, rather it was due to the tactics devised in World War I. To Chennault, the idea of dueling the enemy in one-on-one dogfights was romantic nonsense. Infantrymen do not win battles alone, only by working together as a team. Combining their firepower can they achieve victory. The same, Chennault argued, is true of fighter planes. In 1937, Chiang Kai-shek, after hearing of Chennault's expertise in pursuit planes, asked him to be an advisor to the Chinese Air Force. On his arrival, Chennault found the situation worse than he could have imagined. Chinese pilots who were supposedly combat-ready routinely crashed, simply taking off and landing. Chennault immediately began to revamp the Air Force. He established new training procedures, devised new tactics, and established a vast radio network to warn of the approach of Japanese bombers. Although they were improving, the Chinese pilots were in desperate need of help. By 1941, 100 Japanese planes a day were bombing Chongqing, and the Chinese were having little luck in stemming the tide. Under pressure from Chiang Kai-shek, President Roosevelt reluctantly agreed to let Chennault hire American pilots to fly for the Chinese. Chennault also managed to buy 100 P-40s, which the British had rejected as obsolete. By late summer of 1941, Chennault had recruited 112 pilots and was pushing them through an intensive training program. Flying their first mission on 20 December, the Tigers stun the Japanese. A flight of 20 bombers headed for Kunming is jumped by the fearsome-looking P-40s and is nearly annihilated, with only one bomber returning home. Day after day, the Tigers engage the Japanese with tremendous success. Working in pairs, the Americans make diving passes at the Japanese planes, sending them hurtling toward the ground in flames. Although they are getting the better of the Japanese, the daily combat and the lack of replacement planes and spare parts is beginning to take its toll. Leaking gas tanks are plugged with chewing gum. Bullet-riddled fuselages are repaired with adhesive tape. It takes all the American ingenuity the air crews can muster simply to keep the planes in the air. The Flying Tigers continue to cause the Japanese a considerable amount of frustration. Although their Zeros are faster and more maneuverable than the outdated P-40s, the Americans continue to rack up victories. Although it is certain that this small group of American pilots cannot turn the tide of the war alone, their mere existence and continuing success are enough to worry the Japanese and to spark a flame of hope in the hearts of the American people.
So, as you can see from that, Chennault played a huge role in holding back the Japanese forces before and then after the Pearl Harbor attack, before the United States actually got involved in World War II. So let's talk about General Claire Lee Chennault. Who is he, and what did he do? Who is General Claire Lee Chennault? Claire Lee Chennault was a World War II military leader of the famed Flying Tigers in China. He was born in Texas on September 6th, 1893. Chennault was said to have a turbulent personality, and he often gained the nickname Old Leatherface, which is evident in some of the pictures as to why. There was a lot of people that were avid supporters of him, and then there was also a lot of people that were bitter of the way that they felt they were treated. He died at the age of 64 years old. Chennault had been married twice. The first time he was married to one Nell Thompson. They were married for over 35 years, and they had 8 children together. There are not many photographs of the two of them. This is one of the only 2 photographs I could find of her. His second wife was Anna Chennault. He met Anna while Chennault was in China serving for the Chinese Air Force. They were married for 11 years, and they had 2 children together. And Anna Chennault outlived General Claire Lee Chennault, and actually went on to be a part of a scandal later on during the Cold War with the president. There are many places named in Chennault's honor. Here are a few. The Chennault International Airport in Lake Charles, Los Angeles. The Chennault Aviation and Military Museum in Monroe, Los Angeles. And the Chennault Park Golf Course in Monroe, Los Angeles. Now let's learn some more about the Flying Tigers. What did they do? Small overview of the Flying Tigers is a small group of American aviators who fought their first battles in World War II. They had an unusual mission, however. They were mercenaries hired by China to fight against Japan, so they were not conscripted soldiers like those who were part of the United States Air Force or the Chinese Air Force. They're actually hired by China to fly for their Air Force. The reasoning for this is at the time, the United States was not officially part of World War II. However, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was concerned about the prospect of Japan defeating China and turning its sights on the U.S. This was all taking place before the Pearl Harbor bombing. Chennault, at this time, had already retired from the United States Air Force and was in China helping command the Chinese Nationalist Air Force. Chennault was unhappy with the resources that the Chinese Air Force had and the state that it was in. As stated in the video, it was very poor when he arrived. He realized it was not possible to win with what they had currently, and he knew they needed more. Chennault had managed to get Roosevelt to allow some of the U.S. military pilots to resign and go to China as mercenaries, part of the AVG group. At that time, it was against international rules for an American military person to be involved in the conflict. That is why they had to resign and no longer be part of the United States military. The operation had to be deniable by the United States military as to not break that international rule. The pilots that took part in this were officially known as the First American Volunteer Group, AVG, as I mentioned earlier. And the Flying Tigers consisted of pilots from the U.S. Army Air Corps, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. It also consisted of some pilots from China itself. The pilots from the United States were recruited before the Pearl Harbor attack under President Franklin Roosevelt and commanded by Claire Lee Chennault. The Flying Tigers flew the infamous P-40 fighter plane. The P-40 plane was much faster than the Japanese Ki-27 fighter planes. However, those were becoming obsolete, and they were trying to now beat the new Ki-48 planes, I believe they were, which were faster and more maneuverable. The infamous P-40s flown by the Flying Tigers were decorated with the shark mouth on the nose to indicate who they were. It was kind of their staple. These fighter pilots were said to be the only bright spot in the early days of World War II during the Sino-Japanese conflict. They became a legend amongst the Chinese people for their bravery, and as I'll talk about next, were still celebrated almost to this day. Three tigers celebrated. Bob Lee, Paul Crawford, and David Thompson were all living members of the Flying Tigers, and they were flown out to China and were praised for what they did back during their time as Flying Tigers. It's important to remember that the thanks for the Flying Tigers did not fall off with time, and that the Chinese people still remember what the Flying Tigers did for them, leaving the United States and coming to fly for them and aiding in their victory against Japan. These three remaining World War II Flying Tiger vets, like I said, were flown out to Beijing for the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the ending of the Sino-Japanese War of Aggression. The Chinese flew these three veterans, Paul Crawford, David Thompson, and Bob Lee, over to China and back. They were flown first class and had all of their expenses paid for while in China and feted them at several events. They were even awarded medals. The next day, they were taken by charter airline to visit Shenzhen, where Anna Chennault's Museum to the Flying Tigers is located. It is also where the Japanese signed surrender documents on August 21st prior to the official signing in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. They were treated like kings and honored as returning heroes. It is a trip that they will all remember and cherish, knowing that the Chinese have not forgotten their history and the sacrifices they made on behalf of the Chinese people. The last living member. As of last year, 2021, there was one remaining member of the Flying Tigers. Chen Jim Ping Ching. As of 2021, Chen, who had the nickname Jim, Ping Ching was 104 years old. This makes him the oldest living veteran of the Flying Tigers in World War II. It is important to classify of World War II because the Flying Tigers also operated during the Cold War. Chen's entry into the war started in 1941. He was sent to an air base in Arizona to begin his training. He became a part of the U.S. Air Force 58th Combat Brigade. Chen flew many different aircraft. Some of these include a P-39, a P-66, and the legendary P-40 from the Flying Tigers. Chen still remembers many stories from his time as a Flying Tiger. One of them being a story which I didn't have a chance to include. I couldn't find enough details on it. But one of the stories included was one where he was on a mission and became one of the sole survivors of the fleet that he was a part of from the Flying Tigers at the time, and actually got captured until the end of the war when the Japanese surrendered to the United States. Then that is the presentation on Chennault's Flying Tigers. Thanks everybody for watching that watched. Here's my works cited. Yeah, thank you.